Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of End to End. I'm Alex Stamos.
And I'm Jack Cable, coming to you live from Corridor's headquarters in San Francisco.
By now we assume everybody knows who we are, but if you've been living under a rock or don't spend your Saturday afternoons regularly listening to one of the millions of cybersecurity podcasts that start on any given day, maybe we should do some introductions. Jack?
Sure. I'm Jack. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Corridor. I'm from background in security research, computer science, and building out the future of secure AI coding now.
I'm Alex. I'm currently the Chief Product Officer of Corridor, and I'm working with our customers to make sure we're meeting their needs in secure AI code development.
And part of what's so cool about the space is being able to chat with super cool people in the space. And today I'm really excited to have a friend from our past at CISA and in government, Rex Booth, join us today.
Welcome, Rex. Why don't you tell our listeners about yourself?
Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Alex. So my name is Rex. I am the CISO here at SailPoint. I've been at SailPoint for about 3 years, but as Jack alluded, spent some time in the government. General arc of my career, started off as a developer, moved into the vendor space. I was at Mandiant back when we released the APT1 report, which sounds like ancient history now, but it really wasn't that long ago, I guess. And then from there, I went into the government. I served as the deputy CISO and CISO of some small mid-sized agencies, chief of cyber threat analysis at CISA. And then the last year before I came to SailPoint, I spent at the White House, where I helped stand up the Office of the National Cyber Director. So it's been a fun run. I've had the opportunity to be in some cool places, doing some cool things, but thrilled to be here today with you guys.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us, Rex. Well, maybe let's start with some of your time in government, right? I think you had the privilege of being in government at a very pivotal time, right, for cybersecurity, with the stand-up of Office of National Cyber Director, as well as, as CISA went through an inflection point, becoming an agency and growing out. So why don't you tell us a little bit more just about, especially in the early days of Office of National Cyber Director, what was that like? What were the maybe biggest challenges in standing up a totally new agency in the White House? Tell us a bit about that experience.
The challenges were many, and I'm sure you'll get different answers as you talk to different people from that office at that time. The genesis of it was that the office was authorized. The first Trump administration had removed the National Cyber Czar, and Congress deemed fit to say, hey, no, actually, we think this is a necessary office, and created it, but hadn't yet appropriated the funds for it. So for a while, it was Director Inglis and his chief of staff sitting in a small office in the Eisenhower Executive Office building, kind of staring at each other, trying to figure out, okay, how do we do this now? We've got the titles, we've got the office space, but we don't have the people. And so a call went out to a variety of agencies, CISA included, but also a few agencies in the IC as well, people with kind of cyber mission space, and asked for volunteers to come and join and help stand up this new thing. My name was thrown into the bucket, and a few days later, I showed up at the White House and tried to figure out where to go and what to do. It was an exciting time. It was really kind of greenfield, new space. We were creating new things, trying to figure out not only what does this office do and how does it fit into the broader federal cyber ecosystem, but what is the change that it's trying to affect? What is its philosophy, and what is it trying to promote for the then administration in terms of how cybersecurity and the federal government kind of play together? So over the course of the year that I was there, I served as their director of stakeholder engagement, which really meant just going out and making friends in the private sector and finding ways in which our mission space as a federal government overlapped with their interests as well. And, I had the opportunity to have a lot of really interesting discussions with, some really interesting people about, how does cyber work, within their mission space in ways where you wouldn't necessarily think that it would, or it wouldn't be as prevalent on their radar screen as possible. I'll give you an example. We had a 2-on-2 meeting. The director, myself, Jamie Dimon from JPMC, and his chief of staff. And, the meeting, took place over the course of an hour and, covered a bunch of topics. But the thing that I walked away with, the way in which I was most impressed was, the way in which Jamie was really educated on the topic, really had already established thoughts. He wasn't just sitting there absorbing or reflecting what Director Inglis was saying, but rather came to the table with thoughts on cybersecurity, how it made an impact on his sector and his corporation and his interests. And that was reflected in a multitude of conversations with people at that level that we had. And, look, I think we've been in this industry for long enough to know that cyber used to be a kind of a backwater. And it really has changed and has become a far more prevalent piece of an industry and of enterprises than any of us anticipated.
So you mentioned the old CyberZar position, which, correct me if I'm wrong, you're referring to what eventually became I believe a deputy under the National Security Council. So like cyber in the government used to be very focused on national security and offensive. And so then you have the National Cyber Director, which is a totally standalone, not part of either domestic policy or foreign policy. It was interesting because, with the creation of this position, you have the National Security Council position, you have a director of CISA, which is, under a secretary, you've got the NCD. So you end up with like these three competing powers. You have over under NSA, you have your director / director of Cyber Command, the dual hat position, which then has all this actual offensive power. What was this like to have these kind of competing power centers, all which have very different equities? What was it like then to stand up, somebody who's supposed to coordinate, but then who doesn't actually have, National Cyber Director, how many legions has he? The famous, quote about the Pope.
Right.
What was it like to have all this influence, but not the direct capability to make changes on the ground?
Yeah, no, it was fascinating. So I think you touched on two important points, right? So that cyber, with the creation of the Office of National Cyber Director, the aperture of the White House on cyber expanded from a very kind of defensive, / offensive orientation to something that was broader, right? And something that was more inclusive, not only in terms of its scope and its scale, in terms of the footprint that it tried to establish, but also in the way that it thought about cyber. And one of the things that Director Inglis and his staff around him, we used to promote this idea of cyber being not just a topic that is born in conflict, right? Because that's our origin story. We're talking about people doing bad things and people trying to stop bad things from happening, right? And that's true and that's valid. But there was a sense that cyber could also be something more than that it could be aspirational in nature. And that, that cyber can be an enabling function to allow really good things to happen, perhaps through its prevention of bad things happening, but also, through some of its enablement capabilities as well. And so that narrative changed over the course of, I get the years between the Office of the Cyber Czar and the Office of the National Cyber Director. But two, and to your point as well, it was an office that was created in an existing ecosystem of various centers of gravity and power, as it relates to cyber. So you had the national, you had the FBI, you had the NSA, you had CISA, you had the NSC, and others as well. I mean, it would be foolish to ignore some of the agencies that had very strong equities when it comes to cyber, energy, commerce, et cetera. And navigating those was a substantial challenge. And, and that was mostly shouldered, obviously, by Director Inglis and, the National Cyber Director, but his staff as well, and trying to find ways in which we can coordinate with those other centers of gravity in ways that were, productive and meaningful, but also accomplished a couple of things, right? So one is try to streamline the way in which people interact with the government, right? One of the taglines that Director Inglis would often use is that he didn't want people to have a PhD in government in order to interact with the government. And I think that's a very valid statement, right? And when it came to cyber, look, if you're a company out there and you've got an incident, do you know who to go to? Do you go to CISA? Do you go to the FBI? Do you go to Secret Service? It depends, right? And there's never been a clear answer. Even today, there's not a clear answer, right? Had the opportunity to go to the FBI's CISO Academy, earlier this summer. Had some discussions with them there. Great experience, but that question came up, like, who do you go to? And to their credit, they were relatively agnostic. They were like, listen, like, you go to whomever you have the best relationship with. And if that's CISA, that's great. If it's us, that's great. If it's the Secret Service or whomever, fine, go for it. Just engage was the question. But I'm not sure that's the best answer on a permanent basis. And so that was one of the things that the Office of National Cyber Director was trying to solve. But also, the inter-organizational relationships, those power dynamics, and who wanted to exercise what kind of power, what kind of leverage. And look, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the fact that, like, we're dealing with humans too, and people with personal kind of agendas and egos, and and all those things that you have to navigate as well. And that gets challenging, I think, the kind of the more senior personnel that you're dealing with. And there are some elements of that as well. So ultimately, I think the Office of the National Cyber Director, even today, is still trying to figure out its role in that ecosystem. Director English would describe it as, that he was the coach and the others were the players on the field. I think that's a good analogy, a good metaphor. But there's still a bit of adjustment that federal ecosystem has to make in order to really accommodate and embrace that coach role that the ONCD is supposed to play.
Yeah. So I know a big part of that vision, right, was the national cyber strategy, and talked about really shifting the burden of responsibility in cyberspace to those who are most capable. We tried to carry a lot of that on with the Secure by Design initiative at CISA. That was a couple years ago. How do you think that has played out? Did we succeed in achieving that vision? What more do we have to do?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we've had a partial victory, right? So I think the way in which that has been successful is that it has promoted the narrative of, where does the delineation of responsibility lie, right? If you're talking about, global incidents that are caused by, mega corporations, and have, but the impact is exclusively felt on the end user, whether it's an individual, or a small business or a small corporation. That feels unjust to some degree. I'm not entirely sure how to articulate it, but that doesn't seem fair, right? And so I think the dialogue around that has been raised in a meaningful way. And I know that Director Easterly, when we collectively were at CISA, we talk about that a lot. A lot of her her staff and her leadership would promote that. And I think that's a fair narrative to raise. I think the way in which we've collectively fallen short, or at least so far, right? Because this is a journey. Like we can't expect to snap our fingers and everything's solved. But the way in which we still have opportunity for improvement is in baking that redistribution of responsibility into the ecosystem, right? So there's now, I think, a broad acknowledgement of, yes, this balance isn't quite right. We haven't struck, that right balance yet. But there hasn't been movement in actually, shifting the delineations of responsibility. It's a progress. It's a process, and it's a work in progress, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, unfortunately, it seems like there's been some significant swings to be, between administrations on this for what should be an apolitical topic, right? that just because the last administration was for it, that we should not be for secure by design. And seems like a huge loss to me. And just the loss of good people, both at CISA and at NCD.
Yeah. Yeah. It's important to acknowledge that there's been an impact on on the federal workforce and on the pool of talent that remains. There's absolutely good people that remain there, and I think we're all grateful for them for continuing to carry on that mission space. But there have been people that have left, obviously. The solace that I take, and maybe this is false comfort, I don't know. But the way in which I've always seen the cyber kind of mission space is one that transcends organizational borders. And look, I see that in the private sector too, right? So myself, I'm a CISO at a corporation, and we have competitors in our space. But I feel no qualms about reaching out to my peers, or the CISO of a competitor, or somebody in near space, and asking them a question about, hey, are you seeing this, or how did you approach that? Because I think there's very much a pervasive understanding that this is kind of a one team, one fight when it comes to cybersecurity. And so when people leave the federal space, they leave things behind. They leave authorities. They leave capabilities. They leave things that are unique to that employer, that role. But they don't leave cybersecurity in whole, right? And we all, I think, still contribute to the broader mission space in meaningful ways. And I take some comfort from that.
Yeah, so maybe on that note, now that you're at SailPoint, right, and really focusing, I imagine, a lot on identity security, there's a lot changing, right, with AI in particular, right? We have a whole new protocol, Model Context Protocol, MCP, for communicating between AI agents. How are you thinking about identity security when it comes to MCP?
Yeah, yeah. So there's so much to unpack when it comes to AI, right? So I'll start off at the very high level. That I think all of us are looking at AI with somewhat bated breath, right? There is a tremendous amount of promise, right? Some of it has been realized, but I think that's a small portion at this point, right? And the transformational, kind of life-changing impact that is just kind of always on the horizon, hasn't really hit us yet, right? And that stands true for I think just daily life in general, and it also stands true for the cyber kind of ecosystem. We've been hearing for years that the entry-level SOC analyst, it's a dead role, right? It's going to be replaced by AI, right? And that hasn't quite happened yet, right? There's maybe been an impact, but those people are still very necessary and very important parts of our our defensive posture. So I say all that to say that look, this is a point in time kind of statement and analysis, and that tomorrow it could change because that meteor that we're all expecting could hit us, and the whole landscape could shift. But look, as far as identity and AI and MCP, we look at security of AI in a couple different dimensions, within SailPoint and then, through our products as well. So, ChatGPT hit the global zeitgeist, 3 years ago or so? And when it did, our immediate reaction, or at least my immediate reaction, was that any CISO that stands in the way of this, right, out of kind of fear or trepidation or whatever it may be, is not going to be long for their role, right?
You're going to get run over. Like if you try to lie down on those tracks, that train is not stopping.
No, exactly right. Exactly. And look, that has proven to be true, right? The demand signal at the senior levels of organizations for AI, right, and like agnostic necessary, like it can be like absent of intent or purpose or objective, but just like the responding to this kind of global narrative of the transformational impact and the potential of AI, has driven executives, not necessarily SailPoints, but like, across the ecosystem, to be very, very eager to embrace AI, right? And so, you don't want to get in the way of that. So what we've done, or what we did at the time, was set out a few like very broad principles, right? So, one, if you're going to use AI, we need you to not use it with sensitive data, right? Because we lose control of it at that point. And then two, when you get the results back, you need to like sanity check it, right? You can't just take it and drag it and drop it into like the next marketing campaign or whatever, because we know AI has flaws in terms of hallucinations, et cetera. And then you also have to check it for other people's intellectual property, right? Because the last thing we want to do is take somebody else's IP, bake it into either our products or our outreach or whatever, and then we get in trouble. Nobody likes an angry lawyer. We try to avoid those, right? So, look, with those three broad guidelines, we dipped our toes into the AI space. Now, SailPoint and its products have been doing AI for a long time, but like this is workforce AI enablement, and that's a different kind of paradigm. So, we dipped our toes into it. Now, with this, this kind of broader, I guess, footprint of AI that pervades everything that we do from a tech perspective, right? All of our vendors are coming out with, AI kind of enablement capabilities. We have AI specific capabilities that, that we're looking at and bringing on board. We have it baked into our products, and we have it, baked into our workforce enablement capabilities. We've had to mature that initial, kind of, pretty rustic guidelines that we had. But look, from an identity perspective, like none of that security, none of the objectives of cyber take place within the AI context without effective, identity management, right? And whether that is, like proper provisioning or access controls or kind of making sure that you're tracking AI agents and maintaining visibility within your environment. Like all of that is critically essential, and none of it takes place without without identity. The biggest concern, like from a broad perspective for me, is that anything, if you drop AI into your environment, you take a new agent and you're like, I want this to have access to SharePoint. And I want it to be able, I want a user to be able to use this AI capability to query SharePoint, bring back some results, do some analysis, whatever, right? Perfectly valid use case. And you'd think it would be, a no-brainer to enable that within your environment. But that's assuming that your SharePoint like kind of data source is properly configured in the first place, right? And if it's not, the only thing that AI is going to do for you is it's going to expose all of the flaws in terms of the poor access control that you already have, the poor provisioning that you already have at lightning speed and in ways that you don't expect, right? And so there may be files sitting out there in a share somewhere that have highly sensitive data that I shouldn't see. But I don't know about it because it exists somewhere off in the corner that of a share that I never go to, right? AI is going to find that, right? And when I go and I query and I say, tell me about the average salary of the people on my team, so I can do some sort of analysis, and it pulls that in, and all of a sudden I see other business units, compensation packages or whatever. That's not supposed to happen, and that's a bad day, right? And so, when we talk about AI and we talk about like the security of AI within a corporation's environment, we have to think about it in this broader context of we're operating in a flawed ecosystem, and those flaws are going to be exposed at a speed that we really just can't predict.
Yeah. Of all the ways companies have and individuals have started to use AI in their work days, the place where I think undoubtedly there's been the most value demonstrated is in coding.
Yeah.
So how are you guys allowing folks or supporting your people to use AI in coding? And you've talked a lot in your interviews about building a culture of security. Well, It's hard to build culture with AI agents. So how do then you deal with AI coding agents from a security perspective and trying to all the work you've done on application security? How are you dealing with the fact that people are bringing AI agents in to perhaps write a significant amount of code.
Yeah. Yeah. So, so look, we try to enable that as much as possible. Right. And, to our earlier point, like if I were to stand in the way of that, like I'd be standing, outside of SailPoint pretty quickly. Right. Like, any organization is looking to gain those efficiencies.
And no engineer is going to use Claude Code at home and then go to work and type every line in IntelliJ like they're working in the Flintstones, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. And look, I think all of us know, your audience knows that the developer community is a creative community, right? And they are a group of people who are eager to seek out new capabilities, new functions, new efficiencies. So we need to match that. We need to meet them where they are. And so the way that we've done it is we have kind of I think come to a bit of an agreement point, right? So on one hand, we try to have some amount of control, or we do have some amount of control over the AI-based coding capabilities. Whether it's Claude or Lovable or like, Copilot or whatever, right? That people are using within our enterprise. Because there are some sources that, for a variety of reasons, we don't want in our environment, right? Because they're not trustworthy. But by and large, we're trying to enable them wherever we can. But at the same time, what we've said is that, look, as you use these, right, they have to be used in a responsible manner. From a security perspective, I've become relatively agnostic in terms of the genesis, the origin point of the code, as long as it flows through the rest of the SDLC, right? And as long as it's going through the various kind of control points and checkpoints that we have to make sure that only good, reliable, trustworthy code gets into our products, I'm reasonably agnostic in terms of where it comes from at the beginning. That I think gives our developer community the kind of the breadth of opportunity that they're looking for to be creative, to be innovative, and frankly, it reduces the kind of the level of effort on my end and on my team, that we would otherwise be spending on, double checking to make sure that every source is reliable and every source is trustworthy. Look, as long as things are kind of compartmentalized along the way, they're secure along the way, and then before they go live, before they go into our products, they're checked, they're confirmed. I feel reasonably comfortable.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Rex Booth, CISO of SailPoint. Where can people read your stuff, see your writing, see your talks? Where should they find you?
Can I tell you a really funny story before we adjourn? So sure, I used to have a blog of sorts, and when we went public, our external counsel advised me, hey, listen, like, why don't you not do that anymore?
Was your blog called Material Non-Public Information?
It was not, but they said, listen, like, you're promoting really, like, good ideas, good practices, best practices. But look, God forbid anything bad happen, that can be potentially leveraged. Look, if people want to get in touch with me, reach out to me, rex.booth@sailpoint.com. And it's old, but it works too.
Okay, well, thank you for lying to your general counsel and coming on our podcast. We appreciate it. We'll get this up as fast as possible.
Thank you so much, Rex.
Thanks, Rex.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Another episode of End to End. Join us again. Thank you so much.